Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast, and it's awesome to have you along with us. And as always, awesome to have along our two regular co-hosts, Stu and Tim. Welcome.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
You guys are awesome. We are going to continue a Theology-Strategy-Practice mini-series, but on a different area this time, on our internal training ministry that we call Berea. Now, before we get to that, though, Tim, you have brought to us a cultural artefact. The fact, or really, we are all dyed-in-the-wool Apple fans, I would say. We are all got Apple devices of some version, either on our knees or we're using them. However, there's been an iPad Pro ad that it's been out for a while, but you were showing us that you didn't enjoy. Well, I think even Stu disliked even longer.
I'm a massive Apple fan, but that was a terrible ad. Really, it's not just the worst Apple ad I've seen. It's probably the worst ad I've seen, actually.
I didn't like it that much either, really.
Yeah, no, I was surprised that neither of you had seen it yet. It came out about 8 months ago.
Okay.
And it came from a conversation that Stu and I and a few others were having a couple of days ago just about advertising missteps. And we were talking about, we were talking about the Jaguar most recent.
The rebrand.
The rebrand of Jaguar, and just kind of like, that's a bit weird. What are they trying to do there? But I brought this one up and other people hadn't heard of it. So this came out, as I said, 8 months ago, and it was advertising the new iPad Pro. But what they had done was get all of this analog art and music and sound and games and all sorts of things in one of those entire compression machines.
To squash it all.
The squasher, hydraulic press. Sorry, that's the word.
That's it,
Now it comes to me. And the whole ad is watching this slowly come down with a beautiful atmospheric soundtrack and watching these things slowly be crushed and crumbled and paint tins exploding and those old arcade game being crushed. And I get what they're trying to do. What they're trying to communicate is look at all of the things that we have managed to compact into the iPad. The new iPad Pro is so powerful. It is able to do all of the things that you would normally have needed all of these other things to do. But I remember it because it got universally panned when it first came out. And everyone was like, oh no, you are destroying culture. You are destroying, they destroy a grand piano, they destroy guitars, they destroy arcade games, they destroy all of these things, beautiful trumpets and all. And it's just, people universally looked at it and thought, no, this is what we don't like. And what we're a little bit skeptical of is the way that digital technology has destroyed our ability to appreciate analog technology. And I actually think that the ad would have worked maybe 5 years ago. People would have been, and maybe if you go back a little bit further, you go to that Steve Jobs kind of era of Apple when people were tech enthusiasts and were like, this is really exciting, isn't it wonderful the things that are doing. I think the zeitgeist has changed significantly in the last 5 to 10 years, that people are now a bit tech skeptic. And so we've seen things like Jonathan Haidt we've talked about before, his big articulation of the anxious generation, and too much time in digital world has actually created anxiety and problems. And we're sort of noticing that actually the digital world that we are soaked in, and for many people addicted to, is counterformative. It's actually not doing what we had sort of hoped. We've lost the techno-utopianism that sort of came in that early Apple, Steve Jobs kind of era. And now we're looking at technology with a bit of skepticism, particularly with AI now. Some people are really excited about AI. People are really worried about AI. So there's much more of a mixed feeling. I think what came out in the reaction to this ad was a lot more of those who were, sort of tech skeptics, sort of saying, actually, all the things you're destroying are the things that we're missing, the things that we are actually looking at a bit of a loss, that kids might know how to play Angry Birds, but they don't know how to play a piano. They actually don't know the joy of arcade games and the physicality of, smashing buttons and moving joysticks and, creating art through, orchestral instruments and all those kinds of things. And so I think it hit at the wrong time. And so, it was a massive misstep in terms of communicating what they thought it was.
Stu, why did you get so upset seeing those
same
things crushed?
thing. Yeah, it's also interesting because in Australia at the moment we've got this big debate about when kids should be able to use social media, because there's so much emphasis on how much negative impact social media's got on young brains. And when they do all this research about the rise of youth anxiety and depression and stuff like that, it all goes back to 2008, which is the invention of the iPhone. So the iPhone's created all these problems, and then they're celebrating all the problems they've created by smashing everything up that would probably bring a whole heap more presence to people's lives. Instead of just looking at a screen all the time, spending hours learning how to play a trumpet can actually be really good for someone's self-esteem, but it's also super helpful to learn how to be bored sometimes, just to repeat, just to practice.
Be disciplined.
Painting with actual paint is such more of a physical experience. So we're taking all these physical experiences away from people. The tactile experience of painting a picture with paint, that if you don't keep watering it, it dries too quick, and just a stroke of your finger on a glass screen doesn't give you anywhere near that same enjoyment of life, I suppose. But I particularly didn't like it when the metronome was destroyed. I don't know why. I don't know. The metronome was on the top of the piano, and there's something about that it's a really old piece of technology, but it just keeps time, and so you don't get out of whack when you're playing piano. And it almost to me was a symbol of the whole ad, where actually you just go into this timelessness of the computer, where the computer runs your day and the computer dictates to you what happens in your life, sometimes really mechanically through a calendar, but often through notifications or through games that if you don't get on it, that you lose, and you've got to pay more money to get more improvements, and it's almost like a form of addiction that they're creating there. So I think that metronome was almost like, that used to be a nice time when people needed a metronome, and then they stayed in time. And I just had this picture of some young person sitting at a piano with a metronome. I don't know if you've heard them. They sound quite relaxing. Tick, 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 tick. It's just almost like lots of problems in the world, but I can just shut all that out and just enjoy this moment and be present.
That's really
but I don't need that. Even if I'm learning piano, I don't need that because there's an app for that. I just download a digital app. I don't need the actual physicality of the ticking box, and something lost.
I mean, the one thing that I picked up on the ad was crushing all those things like musical instruments and other cultural, I could say, artifacts. It's interesting that we're getting disappointed that they'd be taken away. It's almost like the history of their development also is being taken away, because we've spoken many times before, like music is a reflection of what's going on in society at the time, and same with those kind of cultural moments, or even like you think about, like you've seen that grand piano being destroyed, like you think of Mozart, for example, like Mozart, his ability to move the genre of music on because of his capabilities of playing music. And you kind of like, it's almost like wiping history clean, isn't it? Even with a swipe of your finger, like you were saying. Like, I think that's the thing.
We dealt with that in another podcast. What's that called? It's called something, isn't it? When the new progressive movement that says that we're starting again. I've forgotten what that's. I'll have to look it up again.
I went to cultural amnesia, but I don't think that's what it is.
It's like a reset. Let's reset culture. So a lot of the progressive movements are talking about, let's reset what we think of sexuality. Let's reset what we think of gender. Let's reset the past, take down all the statues that represent all the old racist ideas of the past. So there's not even anything that sort of is recognisable that would give people some kind of collective memory. And I think you're right, with the digital, there's so much choice that you can live in your own personal bubble where there's not a lot of challenge to your worldview. It's all fairly homogenous, and you can just feel comfortable in this digital space.
I think this isn't exactly what you're talking about, I don't think, but there's the idea of historical snobbery, which may have been coined by C.S. Lewis, I can't remember. But this idea that anything that's old is assumed, like we've moved on from that. So again, it's part of this sort of progressive mindset. Kind of thing, So if it's old, it's obviously inferior. And so we've assumed that anything that's newer is better. And so that seeps into a lot of different things. And I think you're noticing a loss of that. And again, I think the sort of the tech utopia of maybe 5-10 years ago would have been, yeah, how amazing is the iPad? It's so much better than having to learn all of these arduous instruments and do things by hand. But again, I think there's been a significant change, I think, more recently, that people are realising, oh, actually, maybe we chucked the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe, a glass tablet is not actually better than all of these things that have long history and therefore culture and locatedness and anchorage. And so there's a bit of a challenge to that. There's an old idea, I think it might be Chesterton, who talks about the difference between a conservative and a progressive worldview. He says, imagine you're walking through a field and there's a fence. He said the conservative goes, oh, that's probably here for a reason, so I'll leave it. And the progressive comes and goes, oh, what's that doing here? It's in my way, let's destroy it. And so, just that very basic idea that sort of says, one just assumes that something that's old is there for a reason, so we leave it until we understand it. And the other goes, let's run roughshod, and new was always better. And so that was kind of, I think it's Chesterton that sort of has this idea. But I think, again, we've sort of realised that maybe we are losing things.
It's really interesting because before the Industrial Revolution, it was the other way around. Any new idea was viewed with suspicion.
Yes,
because see, old ideas were tied to economic security. So if you had ploughing technology, you had horses and tools that were more reminiscent of the Roman Empire than they are of today. So even though it was only like 250 years ago, the technology they were using is like 2,000 years old.
And you need the sages in your village to teach you how to use the technology.
Yeah. So the young and the old needed each other through economic necessity, because the old people knew when to plant and the young people had the strength to plant. So there's so many differences. So if someone came up with a new idea, we look back and say, for example, wasn't the church terrible about the emergence of science with Galileo and things like that? And there was some stuff that went on during that period that was really shameful and terrible. But at the same time, there was this, I don't know, sometimes I don't think we put ourselves into the shoes of the people of the time. If someone comes up with a new idea that could threaten the economic stability of a village, if someone said, I've got a new invention, everyone's like, oh, okay, cool. So again, we've talked about Andy Crouch a couple of times. He says whenever you create something new, you destroy something. So if you build a freeway, that means you can drive your car quicker between two cities, but you can't ride your horse on that road anymore. So the new thing necessarily destroys something old. And so there's no such thing as just innovation is good in and of itself, because it always has a negative consequence. So that's what I think I don't like about the Apple ad. It's almost celebrating the negative consequences, and there's a bit of hubris there for me, I think. I also think, Steve Jobs attempted to try and connect Apple with culture, and I think Apple have now been creating culture for so long that they assume they are the culture creators. So I remember that old Apple ad where they used to say, smash IBM, that they were smashing the big brother, and they were taking on the establishment and the institution, and now they've become the establishment and the institution.
Yeah,
they're big brother. They're the ones. I only heard last night on TV that on the news they were saying, don't put your Apple iPhone next to your bed when you go to sleep, because at a certain time at night, someone in Australia's done some research, all the phones across Australia take a package and send it off somewhere. So there's it's always listening to us, even though they say it's not. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's on the news, so interesting that people are talking about it. So obviously, Apple haven't really thought about that. I haven't been able to find that word, but it's a form of cultural erasure that I think erasure. Apple are a part of there. It's like erase all that. This is now able to do all that, but it's not talking about the consequence of kids don't know how to play cello anymore.
It's interesting you talk about that industrialization of culture, and I was watching two videos actually yesterday. First one was Matty Healy from the 1975, and he was talking about how the big artists are just like this monumental money producing machine. There's a lot of M's, but and he doesn't say, but he's referencing people like Taylor Swift and Beyonce, that they'll just put out an album, and whether it's good or not, it'll just become a huge thing. And I thought that was an interesting take, because he was like, but you have to put out something good in order to get to that point as well. But he's saying that then they just take advantage of, we've put out something that's good and now we're just going to take advantage of it for our own benefit.
Because new ideas are more economically powerful than old ideas. So before the Industrial Revolution, old ideas were more economically powerful and were distrusted. And now you can see that old ideas are distrusted. And actually a lot of shameful things are happening, erasing old culture sometimes too. Not to the extent of the Middle Ages, obviously, but the idea that we can just create something new that people want to believe in and want to use and don't have the same cynicism towards it as they have towards older ideas. There's kind of like an almost binary embrace of new things over old things, whereas there used to be, before the Industrial Revolution, a binary embrace of old technology over new. So I think my uncle said it when he, in the 2000s, he retired as a panel beater and he was teaching at TAFE, and then he retired from that because he said there's no point, because I go to class and I tell the young trades people about how to fix a dent on a car, and they'll all say, oh yeah, but have you come across the new machine that does X, Y, Z? And he said because they're in the workplace and all these new technologies were emerging so quickly, he said his old ideas in panel beating were just sort of superfluous. So he said that they were teaching him more about panel beating because they knew the new technology. So there's definitely going to be good things about that, but there's also going to be dangers as well.
But I think his argument was that it was becoming institutionalized, like you were saying as well. So then I saw another video of it. Beyonce won Album of the Year at the Grammys this year, and they were saying she had 52 writers on that.
52 on
writers
a song?
On the album.
On an album?
Yeah. And that was...
But it was also... Gosh. It was country album.
It's called, Cowboy Carter was a country album.
Yeah, which was also interesting, was the back and forth about, here's an artist who is not known for country. There are how many hundreds of thousands of country artists who have been working in that industry diligently, putting out albums, making music, trying to etch out a living, making that style of music. And here comes an R&B singer, makes a country album and gets Album of the Year. And whether that was, a slap in the face to all the country and Western, people who have been in that. And so part of the modern conversation is this, blurring of categories as well. And, what does music mean anymore if Beyonce can win a country album of the year?
If she can employ 52 writers.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, I think. And they even contrasted that to Taylor Swift and Harry Styles. They had like 4 or 5 writers on their albums. And then you've got the whole thing of like Kendrick Lamar is a rapper, and he's performing at the Super Bowl this coming week. But he came back out with a diss track on Drake, the rap artist. And then when he launched it, he played it live and played it 7 times in a row. It's like 7 or 8 times in a row. So I think I'm just trying to contrast. You've got this kind of thing of Beyonce trying to take advantage of different genres, where Kendrick is, I stay quiet after my last album and then I'm going to come out with something different. So he's trying to break that institutionalization, but Beyonce and other people like Taylor Swift are trying to take advantage of that. It's just an interesting contrast, that's all. Anyway, we've gone a long way, meandered a long way down that path. But let's go back to talking about Berea, training ministry. We can talk about the theology in our Theology-Strategy-Practice framework. I've got the opening question, I suppose, is, and I think both you guys can contribute to this. Stu, why don't you go first? Why even have an internal training ministry?
I think we're very blessed in Sydney, particularly in the Anglican Church, which is our church, to have fantastic theological education through Moore College and through other colleges in Sydney. I've had the privilege to study at Moore College and SMBC, which is Sydney Missionary and Bible College, and greatly appreciated that. And it's fantastic when we make sure that those forms of training remain as influential and as institutions that help to undergird our denomination. And the thought we have for local training is to what can we do that can supplement that in the local church and actually help people to go on a pathway towards theological study at colleges if that is what they've got time and money to do. So years and years ago, when Matt and I, before we started Soul Revival Church, we were already doing Berea at Soul Revival Youth Ministry, and we went and talked to Cole Marshall, who started MTS in Sydney, and that's a fantastic local church training program, ministry training scheme, which still continues to raise up many people for college. And Matt and I asked Cole the question, if you had your time again, because he was retiring, we said, what would you do differently? And he said, well, although I'm really excited about how many people have gone through MTS and have gone into college, I feel like I would have liked to have thought a bit more about how we can get local training for people in the pews, he used that phrase, to be more and more equipped for ministry in the local church as well. So not necessarily for people who are going to go to Bible college, not to compete against Bible college and do something that Bible college is doing, but is there something we can do to supplement that and hopefully get some of those people to go to Bible college, but also to equip the saints in the local church. So I don't know if you want me to go back to how we started, because Berea was already going for 10 years before we had that conversation with Cole, but it was at once a really helpful conversation, because at once it confirmed in us what we were doing with Berea in local church training, and it also gave us encouragement to continue to invest in that in the future, because Cole thought the Berea model sounded like a really good idea, having people who have been set aside to go to Bible college who can then kind of not only preach at church but can also give back to the congregation by sharing in another format, in a sort of format that's more of a conversational format, just to help people to learn more about the Bible and how Christianity intersects with culture and how they can think through what is their framework for life and what sort of, mainly young people were doing Berea at the time, what does the rest of my life look like as a Christian adult? So all those things are kind of tied up with what we were trying to achieve with Berea.
Yeah, that's cool. I just get Tim's perspective on internal ministry training too. I've been to Berea. You've done Berea as well. Why do you think it's important, or why do you think it's a good thing to do?
Yeah, I think that having something that is local to your church, as Stu said, it helps to complement a lot of the wider things that we can do in helping you understand what's your particular church. There are particular distinctives to every church. Why? Help people to understand that. So part of it, again, is just being really clear about your theology, strategy and practice. Now, again, your denomination will probably have theology, strategies and practices that are handed down to you through tradition. It's really important to understand those. If you're a church like ours in the Anglican, we've got centuries of history from the Reformation period in England that shape how we do church. There are really important things to understand that make us distinctively Anglican, and it's good to notice those and celebrate those. And so obviously at a high level, for those who are being ordained, you do that at the formal Bible colleges like Moore College or Ridley College or whatever it might be. But for the local people to understand, hey, we're an Anglican church, that's going to mean these particular things. But as we've talked about before in Theology-Strategy-Practice, the way we then implement that is going to be a little bit different. So how we do it in this suburb, that church does it in that suburb, or city by city or diocese by diocese or whatever it might be, to say, here at X church, we are thankful for our Reformed evangelical heritage. We're thankful that we're Protestants. We're thankful that we're Anglicans. And we are trying to take the riches of those traditions and do it in this particular way, at this particular cultural moment in time, in this particular place. And so for the people in the pews, as Cole Marshall said, for them to understand that just gives them a greater awareness of how we can be church together in whatever suburb, whatever church it is. And so I think that's a really strong point for local training as well, is you get to sharpen it to your particular setting. How do we do this? And that's not a comparative statement. You're not saying this is the best way to do it, or it's, you're not saying, oh, look at the way we do it. Isn't it amazing? That church down the road, they're rubbish. You're not making those comparative statements. It's just trying to help you to understand we have thought through the distinctive way that we do ministry, and this is why. If we're in this particular region and we have these particular cultural issues or concerns or whatever it might be, if you're in a highly multicultural area, that's going to shape things. If you're in a largely monocultural area, that might be a different culture from the staff. So you might have people who have grown up, who are Anglo, but they're ministering in an area that is, high Vietnamese population or a high Middle Eastern population of Sydney. Sydney's a very diverse place, and so the way that you do ministry in when large population of your parish is of a particular ethnic group or of a diverse ethnic groups, that's going to change things. And so I think local training just helps you to think through how are we, doing the mission of God here amongst these particular people in a way that the larger denominational trainings or larger Bible colleges by nature can't do and also aren't striving to do.
Yeah, and I suppose it helps increase the value of, or at least thinking about the value of being part of a local church and committing to that as well.
Yep. So just one more thing, you can cater it then to your people as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And so wherever your people are at in terms of their,
theological understanding.
The theological understanding, all of those kinds of things, you can pitch it to them.
Yeah.
In a really, really helpful way.
And then show how it relates to their ministry. And,
absolutely.
Yeah, etc. Stu, can I ask you about the genesis of Berea? Like, how did it actually begin?
Yeah, good question. So we, early on at Soul Revival, we were excited to find some new ways of doing ministry. There was a book that came out by a guy called Mark Center III that we've talked about on the podcast before called The Coming Revolution of Youth Ministry. In that book, he said that it's often young people who come up with new ideas in ministry. And so we felt emboldened to participate in coming up with new ways of doing church as Gen X young people. I had a chance to study at uni, and I was studying the history of the Jesus movement, and I was struck by the fact that a whole heap of young people were able to come up with a new way of reaching their generation. I was also struck that as they were doing that, there were adults in their Jesus movement that were speaking into that, and so it minimised some of the theological excesses that would have happened otherwise if young people just had that approach to history where let's just wipe everything and start again. There were people like Billy Graham, people like John Stott. There were others that were actually speaking into the Jesus movement. Billy Graham was actually asked to go to some of the Jesus movement rallies. And so I was watching this interplay between young people who had new ideas about how to use guitars and drums in Christian worship, but also, dress like hippies and have long hair, but still have a real respect for the Bible. So there's these hippies walking around with these massive Bibles apparently in LA. These it was trendy to get the biggest Bible you could because you wanted to walk around with this massive Bible, hippie with a Bible. Yeah, it's Jesus Christ Superstar era, so it was kind of trendy to be looking like Jesus, I suppose. And
who also famously walked around with a massive Bible.
Yeah, I saw the flaw in my metaphor as soon as I said it. Thanks for speaking it out loud. That's funny. Anyway, so I was studying that. I was thinking that, and I'm like, well, how could we start some stuff with Soul Revival that is new, and we're exploring ideas and culture, and how does the Bible help us to work out how to be Christian in our worldview, but also how do we do that with our elders? So I kind of wanted to bring those two things, and that eventually in the 2000s turned into the shock absorber. So that the shock absorber was young people are the flexibility of the church, and the older people are the strength and the wisdom of the church. So a shock absorber on a car needs to be strong and flexible. So older people generally bring the strength of theological knowledge and all the stuff we were panning about the Apple ad, that analog Christianity being brought into a digital age, for example. Whereas young people understand the digital age, so helping the older people to understand how but get them to work together. Don't destroy the piano. Let's actually keep the piano as well as the computer. So at the beginning we thought, this is going to take a lot of thinking. I was really inspired also by Berkeley, funnily enough. Berkeley University, the student politicos there demonstrated against civil rights injustices in San Francisco, and they worked out that when they were paid, some of these students were paid part-time to be on the door at these big hotels in San Francisco, and as they're standing on the door with maybe some African Americans that were standing at the door too, through casual conversation they found out that they were being paid more than the African Americans simply because they were white. So they went, that's not cool. So then they started demonstrating on their campus, which was shut down. So they then demonstrated for free speech, and then they started to get together with the Black Panthers from Oakland in San Francisco, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense used to hand out little red books from Mao at the university. And I know this is a rabbit hole, bear with me. And there's all this, this intrigue, what's going on with this? And the Black Panthers were all dressed in leather jackets and berets, and they were driving around with guns, and it was a crazy time. And they were part of a civil rights movement that actually won some advances at the time. Obviously, there was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and all that was part of the mix as well. But as the 60s drew on, like that all started to happen in the late 50s. But as the 60s drew on, then the Vietnam War, they started protesting that. Famously, apparently they announced at one of their rallies at the university that they'd won the right to have free speech at the university. Previously, what happened is a policeman came to arrest the speakers because the uni sent them in to say, stop these students having a rally, and they surrounded the police car. And there's a famous photo of how the speakers then used the police car as a podium, and they gently got up. They took their shoes off so they didn't damage the car, and they got up on top of the police car, put their microphone on the police car, and used it as a stage. And there's a photo of them doing that with the policeman just standing next to his car because he can't move it, and the guy he arrested for speaking without right from the university in the back seat, arrested. Apparently that sat there for 8 hours while they were all doing speech after speech, which is, I was fascinated by all that. But one of the things that was also happening was the student politicos would get together and spend hours and hours and hours talking about what do they think about things. And so they'd sit around and go, what's our strategy for the Vietnam War? What's our strategy for this? What's our strategy for that? And apparently in one of those meetings in Sproul Hall at the university, the students had booked a room and they were there really late at night still talking about all these ideas. And one of the guys said to one of the young ladies, he said, can you girls go and make us a cup of coffee? And then the women in the room all looked at each other and went, we're not going to make you coffee, make your own coffee. And they actually went next door, and that's when the feminist movement at Berkeley started, because they decided to start their own meeting, and then they talk about their feminist causes. So Alan Turing calls that new social movements, that people gather around ideas and then they collaborate and they interact with all the different things. And obviously that postmodern flavour has significantly impacted our world today with political correctness and a whole heap of other things. So I won't go into all that, but at the time, we saw the culture of our world changing in the late 80s, early 90s, because the Berlin Wall had just come down. And so we were trying to work out, what does it look like to be a Christian in this new environment? And so we thought, like the people at Berkeley, why don't we put aside a day a week where anyone who's available, we're all young, we're all university students and teenagers at that stage, and a few tradies, but people who could put aside a day, I said, why don't anyone who wants to come over to my place and we can just spend a day talking and discussing the Bible and thinking about what it looks like. And we're also influenced in that by a place called Berea in Switzerland, with Francis Schaeffer and Edith Schaeffer started after the Second World War, where they bought a chalet so that they could help in the reconstruction of Europe after the war. And it quickly became a place where young people came to discuss what's happening in the culture. And in a funny way, even that Berea, through Francis Schaeffer's books, he wrote many books about culture and theology, really influenced the Jesus movement and vice versa. So we were interested by that. I got given a Francis Schaeffer book called The Great Evangelical Disaster by my good mate Dave Stonestreet, and that set the direction of Berea, because we thought, instead of doing it as a college or as a, let's take a little bit of the idea from the Berkeley students. Let's not be, I didn't resonate with their politics, but I liked the form that they had that came together. Let's be a bit like that, and let's be a bit like Berea in Switzerland, where we can come together we make a meal together, we just slow down and we just sit around and talk about what ministry looks like. And we've probably had hundreds of people go through that in various forms since then. But when we came up with the name, we called it Berea because we loved that in Acts 17, when Paul went and talked to the Bereans, who in Acts 17, Luke says had a better character than the Thessalonians, who'd just driven them out of town. They sat down and they listened, and so they had a good character. They also had a conviction that Jesus was Lord, because as they studied the scriptures, which they had good competency with, they discovered that what Paul was saying was true. So the Berean Christian church had a good character. They had a conviction that Jesus was Lord, and they were very competent in reading the Bible, and they sat around for ages talking about it. So we thought, what a great name for the training. So that's why we call it Berea. And as a consequence, almost all our youth leaders wanted to be there, even if they couldn't be there every week. And so over the years, hundreds of people have sat around a meal or a coffee in my lounge room or at the church or wherever we might do it. And as a result of doing Berea, I estimate there's something like 25 people who did Berea have gone into full-time ministry in other churches outside of Soul Revival. But also, most of our leadership at Soul Revival that's been around for a long time have done Berea, and also some of those have stayed on as staff as well. So it kind of has been a really good way of doing ministry training in the local church. And I suppose this podcast is actually a digital version of that, really, because we sit around and do Berea when we do the Shock Absorber podcast, really. So, I mean, I've had a few people say to me, it'd be really good if we could do something for people outside of our church as well. So, this is, I suppose, a version of that. Doesn't replace the lounge room with a cup of tea or a meal, but it is a really good example of how sitting around on a long-form podcast talking about culture and the Bible relationally is doing it in community is really good. And
it's that idea of presence that we were talking about with the iPad Pro ad, trying to squeeze that out of the world. Was that it's actually where good big ideas come from, is spending a lot of time together.
That's a really good point. So the Apple iPad is very top down. You're just a consumer of the intellectual property. However, I think when people listening to podcasting, I think there's a sense where people are engaging more again, and that's why I find it fascinating that long-form podcast in the world of TikTok is also becoming a really prominent cultural.
Yeah, it's like one or the other, isn't it?
But when you look in the Bible, like you see it with the ministry of Jesus. His ministry was low-key, long-term, and relational. And when he taught his disciples, he did it in public. The Sermon on the Mount was to the disciples, but the crowds were around him all the time. So I think that's what we're trying to do with Berea. So do something for the disciples where the crowds can come along and listen as well.
Tim, can I get your personal reflections on doing Berea? Because I did it, and I don't think I realised. Now I realise that's what was happening, like what Stu's described there. But I don't think I realised that was happening when I was doing it. Do you think that would be the same for you, or not, or what you got out of Berea?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I think I did Berea in 2001. So with a few other mates, we all came into Stu's lounge room every Friday morning and hung out. Actually, sometimes we ended up hanging out for most of the day. And
it was Fridays one. Friday's a good day to do it.
Yeah,
it's fun.
And a lot of us would, as much as we were able, work out our uni timetables or work schedules so that we could have Fridays free.
Did you?
And that was absolutely, so I was trying to prioritise that. I think maybe it's because the way my mind works my mind automatically goes to the why we're doing things. I was often thinking about that. And I think it was probably a combination of Stu's tutorials on Friday mornings and the fact that I was studying sociology and philosophy at university, but all of which pushed down to that. But why do we do things? Why? Like, what's the foundation? How do we get these ideas? Let's keep digging down further. And so I think that combination sort of trained my, young adult mind to automatically go there and to appreciate the importance of those things. And so I think I was conscious of what Stu was doing. I think I was conscious of we're going, we're trying to get underneath culture. We're trying to get underneath ideas. We're trying to get underneath youth ministry. And so I think I had realised that and really appreciated it. Like, I really loved that that's what we were doing. And that was reflected in a lot of the ways that Stu has led our ministry for 30 plus years now. But our youth leadership meetings regularly on Wednesday nights. We used to meet together every Wednesday night for leadership blahs, and the first hour was always culture. And I think I knew at the time that this was what we were doing. We're trying to build culture. It really struck me as odd and weird when I started working at YouthWorks, and we would talk about helping other churches do training, and we would do training for other churches, and it was very skill-based training. All of the training that we developed and were leading was really helpful things for helping people lead ministry, but it was kind of like 6 tips for up the front skills, like how to be a big presence up the front, how to communicate clearly, how to have thought about the game beforehand so that when you articulate it, it's clear to the children or teenagers that you're leading what you're doing. Or here's how to write a talk, or here's how to do this. Like, it was very much a practice-based training. And I think it took me a couple of years to work out why that felt weird to me. And what I realised was that for so many years in our Berea training and in our BLA training and in the way that we had done ministry together at Guymere, we had done very little of that, actually. We had done a lot more of culture training. We had done a lot more of let's get underneath and understand why we're doing this training. And so for years I had been shaped by thinking about the why much more than the how. I don't remember, I'm sure that people gave feedback, but I don't remember ever having someone sit down and take me through, here's how you do a youth talk. We were just kind of like, we were modelled it, we watched it happen. I think Fee was my SALT coordinator when I started leading youth. And we just kind of started just doing it. We debriefed afterwards of what do you think went well, how might that sharpen. So we did that kind of thing. But it just felt very different, and it felt very, again, long-term, low-key and relational. And I think that bled through in all of the ways that we did that. And so I look back at that and go, oh yeah, I really loved all of that culture thing. And again, I think for people who may be more practical might have found it a bit slow, may have found it a little bit, why are we doing this? I'm not quite sure what's going on. But I loved it, and I really appreciated the way that we did that. And I think it has really shaped the way that I now think about ministry as well, that I want to get into the theology and I want to get into the strategy. And the practice will kind of take care of itself as we kind of work our way along. But if you can understand why we do things, and if we can do that relationally, if we can do that in friendship, if we can do that long term, I think that has shaped a really healthy way of thinking about how we do youth and children's ministry as a church.
And as I said, I don't think I realised that until we were doing that until later. Stu, was there an element of looking at the things that could be broken down and maybe done differently, and that's where the new ideas came, but also why it was so important to stick to the biblical truths that we really held? Like, was that one of the aims?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I was quite transformed by attending campus Bible study at University of New South Wales under Philip Jensen, and as a PhD student, I didn't have time to be in it as much as I would have liked, but I just found that his long form sermons were actually very unique. I wasn't used to someone going for more than 20 minutes. And I think Philip, as many people would say, is one of the only people that could keep your attention for 50 minutes. But that long-form discussion of the scriptures answered a lot more questions for me than... Because I'd always go to listen to a sermon and come home with heaps of questions, like, I don't know if that's been answered or whatever. I don't know if it was his ability to be clear and answer things that he knew young people were thinking about at uni, maybe that's what it was. But I felt like understanding the Bible and how I could see it apply to my own life was a really good format to live by. That built on a concept I was shown at Sydney University, where I did my undergraduate arts degree, and my political science studies in government there. They talked about, when we first started that, they said, we're not going to teach you what to think, we're going to teach you how to think. And I loved that. I thought that's really cool.
I love that too.
Yeah, and Sydney University, I don't know if they're still the same, but they used to say that in lots of different departments. I think they had a bit of a comparison with New South Wales Uni, where they said, New South Wales Uni is more professionalised and it's about telling you what to think so you can succeed in your job. But whereas, if you're studying Australian literature too, looking out over a jacaranda tree flowering in a big sandstone complex, it's not really going to earn you money to be there thinking we're learning for the sake of it. And I think that's what the old universities used to be like, that Christians started actually before the Industrial Revolution. But we've industrialised processes and we've become a little less human as a result. And the interesting thing from Mark Center was he said that the problem with youth ministry is someone will come up with a new idea like the Jesus movement, but then it'll get institutionalised. And people will then say, if you run a Friday night youth group with games and activities and a youth service on Sunday night, that's how you do youth ministry. So then actually the people who are running that principle, which worked in the 70s, forget the founder principle, which is we do that to love, preach the gospel and love the young people. It's not just an event that we run. But Center argues that new ideas, we've talked about this before, but Center uses Weber, who's the first sociologist really, who said that new ideas, new movements, based on Jesus actually, start as an organic movement around a charismatic leader like Jesus, and the bureaucrats, or the disciples in Jesus' case, write down the ideas so that it can spread all over the world. But sometimes the people who take those ideas don't always have Jesus' founding principles of love, and so that can actually be institutionalized in unhelpful ways too. So likewise, new youth group ideas come and then they get institutionalized through institutionalizing process so they can spread. So I read that book back in the 90s when we started Berea, and I thought, what if we went back to a more theological view of institutionalizing relationships rather than institutionalizing just principles of ministry? And so I thought, well, Christianity is about us having a new relationship with God through Jesus, and he's our Heavenly Father, and we're adopted into his family. So theologically, as the people of God, we sit under the Word of God as a community, and we work out what that looks like, putting it into practice. The relationships we have with God spill over into being a family with each other as brothers and sisters. And I think one of the things Soul Revival's tried to do over the years is not just assume that our relationships with other Christians are going to grow deeper in discipleship relationships, but instead of growing discipleship through programs or courses, what if we just create spaces for people to be Christian together, socially and also formally in church services, but also sit around and talk about the Bible instead of sitting around talking about other things. So Berea was a place where people could learn and think and listen. It was me trying not to tell people what to think, but kind of how to think. Like, the Bible is going to give us the framework, then we've got to work out that's our theology or our why. Our how is going to be our strategic implementation of that. Like, what's our big picture strategy? Like Tim was saying, if I'm in a area it's very multicultural, my strategy might look a bit different than if I'm in a place that's more monocultural. So what's our strategy? And we unpack different strategies that Christians have used over the years. And then practice, well, as long as it's like Romans 12 says, love in action, where we're sharing the truth and love of Jesus. I think mission and discipleship is a good summary of our practice. So let's teach people how to do that. And yeah, like Tim said, there's a lot more learning by doing together, which is a bit pre-industrial revolution. So now we professionalize everything. And if someone wants to become someone who makes shoes, a cobbler, then they usually do a course. And someone teaches them how to do the course. They pay that at TAFE, and then they learn to be a tradesperson, how to be a cobbler. But back in the old days, it used to be my dad's a cobbler, and I'll just sit there watching him do it every day, and then he'll let me help, and I'll help. And then relationally, my relationship as son and father is actually part of the process of making shoes.
That's really interesting. I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms, but I think that's exactly what it was that I was noticing, that we had been trained to be youth and kids leaders through apprenticeship, not through education.
Yeah.
And I think that was the shift that I had noticed, was that when I was doing training for YouthWorks, which I love doing and I'm not despising in any way, but the education we're doing at YouthWorks, because we're not locals to the churches that we're training. So we can't actually do it by apprenticeship. We can only do it through education. And I think that is noticing that difference. Is that I learned how to do a youth talk because I had walked beside Fee for many, many years and sat through the tutorials and the blah culture settings and all of those kinds of things. And through that, we learnt how to do things and to make mistakes together and to, I think that's really, really helpful for me.
Yeah, so the idea is to institutionalise relationships, not the actual practice. So that means practice can change, but if we have a good biblical knowledge of what we're trying to achieve, and that's our foundation, and our strategy is thought through and shared and stays the same but can change. If I'm doing soul revival at Ride like Joey is, it's going to look a bit different to what it's going to look like at Kirrawee, but yet the practice is what's changed. It's not the actual strategy really, because it's like Joey is really keen to continue to say at Ride all the time, we share the truth and love of Jesus, person to person, generation to generation, culture to culture, and place to place. So there's that holistic kind of stuff. So over the years we've got a bit better at that. But the funny thing is, Berea was just about as much about including you guys into designing our ministry together and our strategy as it was me communicating it. So I like to start with, hey, this is where my framework is. If you would like to develop a different framework, that's cool. But we looked at 4 different theologies of ministry that Christians tend to have, and then 3 or 4 different strategies, and then practice of discipleship and mission. And then we go back over that and say, does discipleship and mission get promoted through, what framework have you got for your life? And interestingly, some people either went, yeah, I love this and I want to really dive into this strategy that we have at Soli's, and I love the Reformed evangelical theology we have. Or sometimes people went, I love the strategy, but I don't like the theology. Or they'd say, I like the theology, but I don't like the strategy. So some people actually benefited from Berea by leaving Soul Revival, because I used to say to people, and I still do, I don't want you to spend the next 20 years being frustrated with the denomination because you disagree with the theology. Maybe it's better if you explore another denomination or a different strategy. So, for example, my very, very good friend, Riley Spring, whom I love very much, one day was like in Berea saying, I just would love us to be more charismatic. He wanted to be a reformed charismatic, which was, a kind of theme of the 2000s. And as we sat down together, it emerged that it's probably better for Riley not to stay at our church at Guyme, because we were reformed evangelical, not reformed charismatic, and maybe we could unpack that more, what all that meant in another episode one day. But his brother, Jared, loved our theology and loved our strategy. So Riley has actually left Soul Revival, gone to Sovereign Grace, went to America, trained in Sovereign Grace, came top of his class. I don't know, that's a bit proud of me, but I'm very proud of Riley.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's all due to God's work in his life, but I'm very proud of him. And he went and started a church plant in Parramatta, which is going really well. Yeah. And it's different theologically, but the strategy is very similar. So he loved the Soul Revival all age, all stage shock absorber idea, but he wanted to do it from a charismatic point of view, which was different to how we thought it needed to be. So so his brother, he's still a senior leader in our church,
but doing that helped him.
But it helped him
get to that.
Yeah. So for me, that was like helping him in relationship, not to tell him what to think, but to help him to discover what he thought. And that means I can have a framework that's reformed evangelical, but I don't need to impose that on him. But then if he was to join our ministry team at Soli's, then that wouldn't have been a good fit, because we are actually reformed evangelical, not reformed charismatics. Yeah. So I think that sort of thing. Now, some of our listeners might be going, I don't even know what those words mean. Can't we all just be Christian? But I think it's real. I think it's Berea's good. Like it's good to sit down and say, in a non-anxious way, in a non-combative way, let's talk about the differences and similarities that Christians have with each other. Because I'm really glad I went through that process personally with moving from Sydney Uni to New South Wales Uni, and I went from one Christian group to another and was transformed in my theological thinking, because I think both groups were great, but at Campus Bible Study they weren't afraid to say, this is the way the Bible teaches this, and present it really clearly and passionately, But I didn't feel like I had to believe that. I could go to another group on campus if I didn't agree with them. So if I stayed, I wanted to buy into that and be a part of that group. So, so Berea is good for that. And it's good theologically, I think. There's been this unreal story that we have in the Word of God that points us to Jesus and how he changes everything. And, as Reformed evangelicals, sometimes people critique us as, oh, you're pie in the sky till you die. You talk about going to heaven all the time and you're trying to tell people about how they can get to heaven all the time. But what about talking about real life? Well, I've never really understood that criticism, to be truthful, because if I'm living in view of eternity, then that's going to change how I live now. And that's what Berea's theological premise is. If we've got the end in sight and we're living in the shadow of the cross and we're actually in a Jesus-shaped community and we're sitting under the authority of God's word in a Jesus-shaped community, we're still sinful. So we need to talk about that. We need to work out how we can aspire to keep growing and becoming sanctified as individuals, to be more and more like Jesus, holy and set apart for God's work. When we spend $250 on a pair of shoes that wear out in 6 months because they're just sneakers, what does that mean? Like, is that biblical to be a Christian who does that sort of thing? Or I think a lot of that gets left unsaid from the pulpit. A lot of that kind of cultural interaction gets left unsaid within groups of Christians because they're all doing the same thing and they don't want to critique each other. But, there's other things that are really unhelpful that are creeping in to our churches that I've been witnessing, like online gambling. I've talked to some Christians that are like, oh, it's fine. It just enhances the fun of watching a rugby league match to put a bit of money on it. But I'm also thinking, gambling to me is like I'd be interested to see what the viewers and listeners think and what you guys think, but I think gambling's just a terrible thing. Like, if you win, you're taking money off someone else who's lost. And it seems to be antithetical to the gospel to me. It's not just a pastime, because I'm taking money off someone else. And actually, the company that's making me do that is taking all my money as well. So they're getting rich off. Yeah. And if I contribute to that, I'm contributing to, helping supporting a system that's breaking up families and ruining lives and I'm real anti-gambling, actually. But yeah, the more and more I talk to Christians about it in church, though, if I only talk to someone for 15 minutes after church and they said, oh, I just had a bet on sharks yesterday and I lost, and it's pretty hard for me to go, oh, do you want to sit down and have a talk about that?
Challenge that a bit.
Because the next thing they say is, now I'm off to go and have lunch with so-and-so. See ya. Oh, okay, cool. So we have this sort of superficial layer of discipleship. Even in our Bible studies, if someone dropped that clanger in a Bible study, the rest of the Bible study would probably go, well, we've got to go through all the material. We've got to have prayers. We've got to have everyone have a turn. So Berea is a place where people can come and go, well, what do we think about gambling? I don't know. Let's talk about it. And yeah, we've got a set group of things to talk about. But how does the Bible help us to live today? And that's how it started solely. Sorry to interrupt, but when we first started, we thought we needed to be a cool youth group and that would be successful. And we didn't get it going trying to be cool. But when we came across Matthew 22:37-40, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbour as yourself. And we just went, that's it. That's the youth ministry we want to be. That's pretty good principle. And now let's explore that. So Berea kind of grew out of that. Week Away grew out of that. Saturday night, sitting around for hours talking, grew out of that. And it actually became really similar to the Berkeley university students who spent hours and hours really trying to think through life, and as a result changed the world. Like, as Christians, we've got this opportunity to be a part of a worldwide movement that is changing the world. Yet we sort of in the West have kind of just got this view that how much do I need to give to church rather than how much, what do I want to give? Like, I want, can I learn more because I want to rather than it gives me a qualification or says I can run a youth group. I'd rather people sit around and go away and maybe not be great at running a game in a youth group, but they've decided they're never going to gamble. I'd be pretty stoked with that, actually.
Fair enough. I just that creating that presence is what's really cool, I think, and the ability to do that, which is what we've been talking about in the whole episode. I remember and I love that bit at Berea, we just commenting on Berea saying, the contrast between how to think and what to think. I think that's a really, really good way of summarising what Berea is. But I do remember, one of the things that I still remember a lot is talking about Weber and the institutionalisation of ideas and things like that. And I remember being quite worried because I was like, can't be like that. we can't institutionalize anything we're doing here at church.
Did you?
Yeah, a little bit. More of just like, but if that's happening everywhere else, what stops it happening to us?
Yeah.
But then, as you point out, like institutionalization of relationships helps prevent.
It does,
prevent
and I
that
think
happening.
the jury's still out if that actually works, but I think it does a bit. Like we've still stayed fairly fresh, for over 30 years because the older and younger people listen to each other and they work together because they love Jesus. And because they love Jesus, they're partnering with Jesus together to be an organic community as much as they can.
Yeah. And I think we do try to live that out as a result. Tim, final question to round us off. We mentioned Acts 17 as one of the biblical underpinnings of Berea, but you also found some other verses about training, which is probably a good way to kind of think about if other people are looking at it thinking, maybe we could do an internal ministry training program, or maybe we can change ours. The couple of ones I think you got from Proverbs and Hebrews. Do you want to let's chat about that a little bit and do our own little Berea session about why Berea is good?
So
from the Bible.
I mean, again, these little mini-series thinking about theology, strategy, and practice, and obviously we're weaving in and out of all of those at the same time. But theologically, as evangelicals, you want to go back to the Bible and go, okay, well, I mean, what's the reason for this? Why? What's the why behind the why? And so I think a good place to go through is to just see as a common thread throughout the scriptures this idea that those who trust in God, those who trust in Jesus, should be growing. They should be maturing. It's expected that you don't stay where you are in your discipleship, as we would say, this side of the cross. And so we do see this throughout the Bible. We see these instructions to tell the next generation the ways of tell the next generation the works of the Lord. And so we see, Proverbs 2, as you said, is a great one. Proverbs the whole thing is structured as if it is a father talking to a son, which is basically kind of this large extended metaphor for the idea that all of us are growing under the leadership and direction of those above us. And so as it plays out this metaphor, it talks about in chapter 2, my son, if you accept my words, store up my commands, turn your ear to wisdom, apply your heart to understanding, call out for insight, cry aloud for understanding. All of this, it's this seeking, it's this posture of, as we are growing,
really
we are constantly seeking to know more, grow more, love more, understand more, not for its own sake. And the big theme of Proverbs is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which stops us from disconnecting our head knowledge and our heart affections, and also our doing, the obedience as well. All of those are sort of integrated in this idea of fearing the Lord, because to fear the Lord, you have to know, you have to understand cognitively who the Lord is, and so that's a part of it. But it's also a emotional, affective relationship with that God. To fear Him in not a worried sense, but in I have respect and awe and appreciation of how amazing and awesome and large you are, and that you are so other than me in very important ways. That is a relational aspect. That's not just in your head, that's in your emotions, in your gut, it's in your heart. So that's a key part. And a lot of Proverbs are just really practical. It's the obedience. It's the how do we actually do this life of obedience to Yahweh, as we understand in the Old Testament. Jesus is the clearest fulfillment of Yahweh, so we become disciples of Jesus this side of the cross. And so this rhythm throughout the Old Testament of we should be growing, we should be aspiring to know more, to delve deep, to meditate on God's word. Psalm 19 and 119 are both really strong on this, and lots of other places as well. So we see this as a theme throughout the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, again, the fact that we want to be growing as disciples. There's lots of comments about, maturing, growing in our understanding. Hebrews 5, the end of chapter 5 and the start of chapter 6 are really good on this. So the writer of Hebrews is kind of chastising his audience. He says, at this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk should still is being an infant, not acquainted with the teachings of righteousness. Solid food is for the mature. And this little chastisement that he's giving them in this sermon is, underlying that is this assumption that if you've known Jesus for a while, you should be growing. Don't be satisfied with an understanding of Jesus that stopped at the time you became a Christian. So, many people in our churches became Christians or made decisive commitments to Jesus in their high school years or young adult years. That's great. Don't stop at a youth group understanding of Scripture. If you have grown beyond that in age, you should have grown beyond that in your understanding of who Jesus is and how we understand him. Your thoughts of God, your affections towards God, your obedience to God should be more complex than when you first became a Christian, because that's what God expects of us. And again, not for its own sake, but because we actually want to be in a really deep relationship with Jesus, and that's what this entails. So in terms of building a theology, like where does this come from in the Scripture? Why would you want to have a part of your church's ministry that is focused on growing people? They're the sort of places that we go to. Actually, this is God's desire for us, is to grow as Christians.
And also tenets with what she was talking about, the hope that transforms us as a result, that we do want to keep growing rather than be stagnant. And I think you're 100% right. And I think sometimes I get frustrated I'm not growing enough, but that comes down to what I'm doing and how I'm responding to God as well. But I think it's been a really fantastic chat. Thank you guys. And we'll continue to talk about the strategy of Berea next year. Maybe not next year. Maybe next episode might be a good move. But it's been really great chat. Thank you very much, guys. And thank you to everyone listening or watching as well. We really appreciate it. And you can email me, joel@chocolabsorber.com.au, if you want to get in touch and talk about the things that we are talking about. Otherwise, chuck a comment in our YouTube channel, and that would be amazing. But otherwise, we thank you very much for paying attention to what we had to say. But as always, guys, we'll finish with a one way. So thank you.
One way.
One way.